Well, thanks for coming. I believe this is the last session of the day before we do the lightning talks in the next session in the auditorium. I'm Lisa Ridley. I'm a solutions architect and consultant for ProMet Source, and this presentation is on getting started with Docker for development. Solutions architect at ProMet Source, also a bit of a Docker evangelist. I've kind of seized on this technology and really like it. Have started using it on my projects and have been selling it hard and heavy to Johnny since I came back to ProMet Source. I'm also an automated regression testing champion, unit testing, functional testing, visual regression, user acceptance, all of the testing platforms. I'm a big proponent of test-driven development, having adopted it and used it almost exclusively for the last year on client projects. Takes a little while to get into that groove, but once you do, it's like, okay, I'm not sure I want to develop any other way. This is awesome. It really does. If you adopt it as a practice, it really does help improve the quality of the code that you write. I'm lhridley on Drupal.org, lhridley on Twitter. If you run across lhridley, it's probably me. I'm lhridley on GitHub, although I do publish some stuff on GitHub under a pseudonym of Code Mentality. And the only place I'm not lhridley is on LinkedIn. I think somebody already had that when I registered my account there. Let's open source this slide for just a little bit. How many use... What type of development environment are you currently working in? How many people are using MAMP or WAMP or a locally installed MAMP stack for development? Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And how many folks are using some sort of virtual machine? Vagrant, VMware, Parallels? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Doing development on a remote server? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many are using Docker or containers in their development stack currently? Nobody. Okay. And I'm not sure there's anything else. I think we've covered them all, but doing development using anything else? Okay.
Other container platforms? You mean other container platforms?
In any other tool sets that you're using to do development? I think we've covered them all, but if you were, I was going to ask, please share what you're doing. Okay. All right, so what is Docker? If you read on the Docker website, they'll tell you that it's an application that automates the deployment of applications in software containers. All right, so what does that mean? What that means, basically, is a software container is a bundle that contains not only the software application that you're running, but all of the binaries and libraries that it needs to operate. So you don't have to install it and install a bunch of other stuff on your server when you're trying to get it to run. You just put the container on your server, and it's self-contained and has everything that it needs. If it needs a certain version of Python, if it needs a certain version of curl, if it needs a certain version of a particular package, and maybe it's a version that doesn't come in the package management software for the flavor of Linux that you're running on your server. It comes on a different flavor of Linux. Well, you can still bundle it into this container, put it on your Linux server, and fire it up, and it will run. It is, in technical terms, an operating system abstraction layer, in that it provides there's an engine that sits between the container itself and the underlying operating system. However, the container does share the kernel components of the underlying operating system. This project was written by a company out of France that has since filed for bankruptcy. They open sourced this project in May of 2013. So this is a fairly new project in terms of its lifespan, and it has rapidly evolved since it was open sourced. So a Docker software container, the technical definition is that it's an isolated user space instance that contains a complete application with all of its dependencies needed to run properly. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, it shares the underlying kernel. If you SSH or shell into a Docker container, it looks and feels just like any other virtual server or physical server. Okay, so what does this look like from an architecture structure? Well, you've got your hardware infrastructure there at the base, just like you would with any server. And sitting on top of that infrastructure is your host operating system. Well, then you have what's called the Docker engine that sits on top of the host operating system. You install this engine on whatever server or cloud server that you're going to be running Docker containers on. And the containers itself contain the application and then all the binaries and libraries, and they're bundled into a nice little bundle that communicate with the host operating system through the Docker engine. And you can have multiple containers sitting on a server that do various and sundry processes. The concepts of these containers are built around what's called a microservice, in that a container has one purpose. So you don't have a container, if you're doing your containers correctly, you don't have a container that's got a lamp stack in it. You have a container that has Apache in it. You have a container that has PHP in it. You have a container that has MySQL in it. So each one of those applications is containerized, and they talk to each other and perform just like they do when they're installed on a server. There's some technical things you have to do to make them communicate with each other, but the intention of that is to encapsulate those individual processes. Compared to a virtual machine, this is kind of to answer the question that we were talking about earlier. With a virtual machine, you've got a similar infrastructure that you start with your hardware infrastructure and your operating system, and then with a virtual machine environment or a virtualized environment like DigitalOcean or Linode or Rackspace, you have what's called a hypervisor that sits on the physical machine. And then the virtual machines themselves, you may have a single physical machine that may host a number of virtual machines, and those virtual machines are fully encapsulated and they have their own operating system installed inside them, with binaries and libraries that go with whatever flavor of Linux is installed or whatever third-party libraries you've installed on that particular virtual machine, and then you've got applications that run on that virtual machine. You can have multiple virtual machines that run single applications, or you can have a behemoth virtual machine that runs multiple applications, which is, in our world, I think is more along the lines when we're working with a virtual machine, that's what we're looking at. Well, with Docker, in comparison, you've got the Docker engine that replaces the hypervisor, and then you've got the containers that have binaries and libraries and applications in them, but there's no operating system inside the containers. There's something that looks and feels like an operating system, but there is no actual operating system that resides inside these containers. They share the kernel that's in the operating system on the host. And this is, more along the lines of what we're dealing with when we're dealing with virtual machines. We're developing in a web environment where we've got a single virtual machine that has multiple applications installed in it. So, as a developer, how can Docker benefit me? Well, some of the benefits of containerization is that your development environment consists of components now. This is kind of a bit of a mind shift when you're shifting from a VM environment or a lamp stack environment. You're shifting over to using Docker. You build your development environment from components, these different containers. Kind of think of them as software Legos. So you pull the Legos that you need and you assemble them into a stack. And your components in a stack can be swapped out as you need for different clients or applications. And if you are using Docker in a production environment, you can deploy these containers to production. So the containers that you use when you're developing the application can be the same containers that you run on the production server to run your application that you developed. Anybody see an advantage to this? Yeah. So thinking about containers as components, we touched on this a few minutes ago. You've got an Apache container, a MySQL container. Say I've got an application I'm developing for a client, say it's a Drupal application. So I'm developing it currently on PHP 5.6. I have my client application container, client data container that keeps my client data. So all these applications are isolated. And you can reconfigure this stack if you need to. It's fairly painless. Say I want to pull Apache out, I decide for whatever reason I want to use Nginx as my web service. Okay, all my containers need to know is that there's a web service on the stack. They don't care if it's Apache or Nginx. So I can swap out, since I've encapsulated my web server, I can swap out Apache for Nginx, just change a few configurations, settings, and I can spin it up and I'm up and running. I can pull out, see, I've got an application that I've developed on PHP 5.6, and I want to test this application on PHP 5.7. I just pull out the PHP 5.6 container, drop in a PHP 7 container, and if I have maintained a good test suite, I just fire off my test suite and see what breaks. And then I can focus, gives me a good idea on what I need to focus on in terms of upgrading this, this application I've written for a client to go from PHP 5.6 to PHP 7. So reconfiguration is really painless. I decide for whatever reason, for performance reasons, that I want to introduce memcached in this project. So I just go get a memcached container, drop it in, configure my Drupal application to start caching things to memcached, and I'm off and running. Or maybe I tried memcached and didn't really like the results I was getting there, so I want to use Redis instead. Pull the memcached container out, drop in Redis, do my reconfigure my Drupal application to cache things to Redis instead of memcached, and here we go. Want to play with some front-end caching, and put a varnish container in here, wire that up. Boost my search up with Apache Solr or Elasticsearch. Just grab an Apache Solr and Elasticsearch container, put it in here, do some configuration on it, and off I go. Now I want to do some testing with a Selenium application, so I drop a Selenium container in here, use that in my development and testing environment, and then when I get ready to deploy to production, I deploy everything but the Selenium container to production, because I don't need to be running my tests on my production server. Updates can be simplified. If you've containerized, now I've not personally taken the step of containerizing the client applications yet, but I do know of some folks that have. So if you need to update the client application itself, and you containerized it, you bring in the updated application. Run your update scripts on your MySQL database, and you're off and running. So an example client application might look something like this. So this would be a Drupal 7 application. So I've got a web service that's containerized, and this one's going to have. We're going to look at a stack here in just a second. So I have a web server that's Nginx, PHP. Database server, I'm using MariaDB for this particular stack. I got a memcached caching layer in here. A search engine server, I'm using Apache Solr for my search engine. And this particular stack's got a document parsing server on it. We're using Apache Tika with a Node.js wrapper on that. And I've put Apache Tika in its own container. This is what that configuration looks like for all of those containers. So I've got my containers are all defined as services. You can see I've got Nginx, PHP. We'll talk about MailHog in just a minute. It's a development application that you can drop in that serves as kind of a pseudo SMTP server, so that you can do all of your you can set up your Drupal site to send out all your mail that needs to be sent out, and MailHog will just catch it when you're sending it out, instead of it going to a real mail server. Then you push it out to production, take MailHog out of the mix, and it just picks up and sends out to the mail server you originally configured. Got a database server over here that's configured as a service, memcached configured as a service, Solr configured as its own service, and then Tika. And then I've got some data volumes here that are storing data from the database and data from my indexes for my Solr instance. So it's not terribly complex. This Docker stack is using an application wrapper for Docker called Docker Compose. This file is a YAML file, and it just lives with the source code for my project. So this YAML file basically contains all of the configuration definitions for my services that are running in Docker containers to talk to each other. So as a developer, how can you all get started using Docker? Well, you need to install some software on your development machines. If you're using Linux, you're going to need to install the Docker engine and Docker Compose. Those are actually two distinct separate applications. If you are using a Mac or Windows for development, the Docker group maintains what they call Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, and it comes bundled with Docker Compose, Docker Engine, and an application called Docker Machine. They're all bundled to work together, and you can just install that bundle from the Docker website on your machines, and you'll be up and running. Then for a particular project, you would create a Docker Compose file with your stack definition, and then you execute Docker Compose up-d, and all of those containers will come up and will be running on top of the Docker engine that's installed on your development machine. You install a Docker engine on a your hosting server, and run those containers on your hosting server as well. Now there are some projects that are out on the web that can kind of help jumpstart your development efforts if you're wanting to get into Docker and get up to speed and get something working that you can start putting your hands on fairly quickly. There's Espresso PHP. This is a project that's been done by some of the developers at ProMat, and we open sourced that about, 3 weeks ago, Johnny? 4 weeks ago? This basically is a predefined stack that will let you spin up a LAMP stack to get started on a PHP project. Doesn't have to be a Drupal project. It might be WordPress. It might be a Symfony 2 project. It might be Laravel. It just gives you a basic stack that's going to have a LAMP server, and I think it's got Mailhog and PHP MyAdmin, yeah. So a couple of little tool sets there that are specific for developers to use. Docker for Drupal is another one. I've used this one on a couple of different projects. It's a pretty nice little stack that's put together by a company called Wadby, and they've open sourced this. They actually have two of them. They do a stack for Drupal and they do a stack for WordPress. And they've got pre-configured containers that work together. And for the Drupal stack, they've got Drush and Composer pre-installed in the PHP container. For the WordPress stack, WordPress has an equivalent to Drush. I'm not sure what it is because I don't do much WordPress development, but the WordPress stack has that tool set installed in the PHP container, so it's pretty much ready to go. You spin it up, you put your WordPress or Drupal source code in a particular directory, and you've got pretty much a working stack to start with. There is on Drupal.org, there is a Docker-based development environment. This is the node that you can find more information on it, and it has links to the GitHub repository for it. That particular stack has got a lot of setup scripts that come with it. There's shell scripts that have been pre-written that you can run and execute, and it will install Drupal and spin up a working stack for you. I believe this right here is the URL for the GitHub repo for that particular one. There's tons more out on Drupal on GitHub. You can just pick your flavor. There is a Docker Hub is a hosting environment similar to Drupal, similar to GitHub, where you can host containers. And there's a lot of open source containers hosted out there. The Docker team itself maintains a list of what they call official containers, including containers for Apache, PHP, Nginx, all of the SQL database servers you can think of, MySQL, MariaDB, Percona, the Postgres, MongoDB. If you want to play with MongoDB, but you don't want to install it on your local machine, you can go grab a container and spin it up, and you've got a MongoDB instance that you can start doing some playing with. One tool I want to mention for those of us that develop on Macs. Now there is a little bit of a limitation, and although it is greatly improved over the last 6 months, there is a file sharing constraint with OS X, in that if you are sharing a local volume inside a Docker container, that sync across that barrier, and there's similar issues with a VM, but it's a little bit more pronounced with Docker, is slow. So that connection process is slow. There is an application that you can install called Docker Sync. Somebody got tired of fooling with the latency issues that doing Docker development on a Mac was causing. And so he wrote this application called Docker Sync, and it is a Ruby-based application. So if you've got Homebrew installed on your Mac, you can install Docker Sync with Homebrew. This is a URL. He's open sourced this. This is the URL for his main website, and then all of this is hosted out on GitHub. In a GitHub repository, he's got really good documentation on how to make Docker Sync work on your Mac with a Docker project, and it really does significantly improve the performance with that syncing issue that you have sharing local file structure. All right, now this presentation is designed just to be a high-level overview, and then we've got plenty of time. Let's take questions. Anybody got questions? Curious? You want to ask about something? Anything you've heard about Docker? Good, bad, ugly?
Do you have any examples of using Docker on Amazon Cloud, the Amazon Web Services?
Do I have examples?
Or any kind of things to look out for when you do that? Because I know some people are starting to think of running Docker in the cloud.
Amazon's actually investing some significant resources in optimizing a cloud environment for containerized applications. So I've not personally done anything with it, but I'm hearing good things about it. Google Compute Engine also has done the same. Then Red Hat's got OpenStack, which is a containerized. It is geared and tuned specifically for hosting containerized applications.
Yeah, that's OpenShift.
OpenShift, yeah, sorry. Anything else? No?
So what would the steps be to containerize your client application?
Well, you need to actually spend a little time looking at what makes sense to put inside a container. For example, if you're looking at a Drupal application, if you step back and look, since we're all Drupal developers, let's use Drupal as an example. If you step back and look at Drupal, what would you think that you would want to containerize? I'm gonna put it back on you for just a minute, but I want you to think about it. Considering what I've told you, you're already available in containers. What if you were going to containerize a Drupal application? What do you think that you would containerize?
Some of my base code, I guess. I don't know.
What about Drupal itself?
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Code,
Yeah. The contrib modules, maybe containerize a Drupal installation with some commonly contrib modules that you use on a lot of projects. You could bundle all of that into
so
a container.
instead of creating a profile, right, for like the same kind of sites I build all the time, instead of creating a profile, I can containerize it.
Yep. You could containerize that. And rather than doing an installation with a profile, you would have basically a Drupal installation that has all of the contrib modules pre-bundled with it. Now you would still have to do the wiring up with a database server and get your database initialized. So you'd still have to run the install script, but you could have all of your modules pre-selected and have them all bundled together instead of having to pull them all down from Drupal.org.
How do the containers communicate with each other? Say your PHP and your MySQL.
Well, what Docker sets up internally inside the Docker structure when it's running, the Docker engine actually creates what's called a network. That functions very similar to it functions similarly to the internet or an intranet, but basically it's a network that's available for all of the Docker containers. And Docker can run multiple networks, so you can isolate a network to a particular stack. And so basically any container that you wire up to this internal network can talk to other containers through a Docker hosted DNS service. So every container that runs on that internal network that Docker manages gets an IP address, gets you can assign an alias to it so that you can use the alias to access that instead of the IP address assigned to the container. And those containers can network with each other over that internal network. In fact, that's how the containers communicate with each other. It's called a bridge network.
Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't it have like a name, like a butler's name?
Does it have a what?
It's named after like a butler or something like that? Like Jenkins? Is that what you're talking about?
No, that's something. Jenkins is something completely different. No, I mean the default Docker network is Docker 0, but you can name that network. You can put a label on that network and call it whatever you want to, because you can have multiple ones.
What kind of tools do you have available to monitor the performance of the different containers?
All right, Johnny.
I did not pass him that.
Yes, you did. You primed that one, I'm sure. Tools that are available. You can pretty much use any of the monitoring tools. You just have to configure them to access the containers.
So you would use a tool that's specific to that container. Is that how you would start? Or like new relics?
I'll be honest, I've not wired up any performance tools to try to monitor the performance of a container, because primarily what I've been using them for is development stacks.
Right.
I'm just now really getting started in production. I've had clients that have them running in production, but they manage the production piece of it. We didn't manage that. So
that's built into OpenShift.
Yeah, I would imagine that it would be. Yeah. And do any of you hosted Drupal applications on Pantheon? Pantheon's a containerized environment. They're not using Docker, but they're using containers.
So let's say I'm using Oracle SQL Developer or SQL instance. I'm just curious. The comp files for that are kind of I feel like obfuscated. They're like in a lot of different installation or install locations. Would they still technically be accessed the same way, even if they're in a container? Like if
I'm not familiar with how it works because I've never used it, so I'm not sure. But you might Google Docker and what's it called? Oracle
SQL Developer.
Google Docker SQL Developer Oracle and see what comes up, because if they've containerized it, there's probably a container out there somewhere, and there actually may be one maintained by Oracle.
Oh, so there are some things that might not be containerized.
Do they have an official image? Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
So let's say if you have, if you do like on one server, you have your test environment and you have multiple test environments. Are they all going to be? They're all going to have their own comp files, I suppose, like different.
You're over my head because I'm not
sorry.
familiar with the application, so I can't really answer that. I would need to know more about how Oracle.
Oh no, I'm just saying
how that server works.
Anything in general, like let's say it's even like PHP. Would they all have their own PHP INI file?
Yeah, the PHP INI file resides inside the container, so I could have 10 PHP containers running on a server, all with different versions of PHP in them, all with different PHP configurations, all with different PHP extensions installed.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You use Docker Sync, right?
I have used it, yes.
Do you do rsync or Unison?
I use Unison when I've used it. I have run into some issues with Docker 1.13 in Unison, though. I just switched to Docker 1.13 recently and started getting some errors on a project, and I didn't have time to troubleshoot it, so I just pulled Docker Sync out. But I have found that with Docker 1.13 that the latency issues on Mac OS X seems to have decreased.
Okay, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
Decreased significantly, you feel? Because I did a Symphony app, which has a lot of I/O. It was unusual.
Not knowing the particulars of your application, I couldn't speak to that, but I've got a pretty significant client Drupal application that we just switched off of a VM onto Docker, and there's a lot of chatting back and forth with the file system, and while it is slower than I would like, I'm living with it for now because the benefits of containerizing that complex stack that I'm using. In fact, that's the Docker Compose file that I put up. The benefits of having it containerized outweigh any of the latency issues right now. It's a support client, but I am looking at ways to speed that up.
So the Docker Compose file, does that essentially manage a stack, or does it just manage the one Docker container?
No, you can manage multiple containers with Docker Compose. Docker Compose is an application developed by the Docker team to work with Docker. so that you could manage a stack rather than managing an individual container. You could take, because they saw the need that people would not want to run just single containers, they would want to run a combination of containers together and have those containers work with each other. And so that's what Docker Compose does. Any other questions?
So are there alternatives to Docker Compose, or like how you set up the containers?
Well, there are other orchestration packages out there. You could use something like Kubernetes or Apache Mesos. Those are probably overkill for doing a local development stack, though. Docker Compose it's pretty easy comparatively speaking. If you looked at what it takes to configure. Kubernetes is a tool you could use for it, but Kubernetes is actually developed by the Google team, and they open sourced it for managing clusters of computers that host containerized applications. So Kubernetes manages the deployment of containers to multiple nodes. So you might have 100 machines on a Kubernetes node, and you want to spin up an application and you need 5 instances of that application running behind a load balancer. Kubernetes manages the deployment of those and the monitoring of those and killing off an unhealthy container and spinning up a new one in its place and that kind of thing. So it's overkill for local development.
And that's what OpenShift does.
Yes.
It's on top of Docker and Kubernetes.
Does OpenShift use Kubernetes?
Yes.
Okay. That doesn't surprise me. Red Hat's done a lot of work with Kubernetes.
You can scale up if you want to deploy another image.
Yeah.
And it just spins it up, and then it automatically load balances.
Yeah, I'm playing with a Kubernetes stack at home on a Raspberry Pi cluster. I've got a 7-node Raspberry Pi cluster with a master that's running Kubernetes, and I'm playing with deploying applications across the different Raspberry Pi nodes.
Minishift, which is a local version of OpenShift.
Okay.
I just released that last week.
Did they? I've been watching the Atomic project that Red Hat has. I'm interested in that. I would really like to see a cloud provider provide us with the ability to spin up an Atomic VM. DigitalOcean's got a CoreOS VM that you can play with if you want to play with one of those really strict. With Docker, I'm talking about something a little bit different, but with Docker, there's come a plethora of what I would call slimmed down versions of Linux that are slimmed down and designed specifically for running the Docker engine or something similar along those lines to run containerized applications. So you don't have all of the cruft that you have in the distributions. They really are stripped down to the Linux core and just some essential applications. The ones that are installed depends on the philosophy of the team that's developing that particular operating system. But there's CoreOS is one. Atomic is one. I think it's Ubuntu Snappy is the canonical version of that. There's Rancher OS, which is I think it's a 20 meg operating system. It's tiny, and they're all trying to find their own place in the container ecosphere. So it'll be interesting to see which ones emerge and which ones die off. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I think we're about at our time limit. So thanks for coming and thanks for listening. And just kind of a plug. I did a training yesterday on getting started with Docker for development. I walked the group that attended the training through how to build your own stack, how to build custom containers, how to configure them, how to make them work with a Drupal application, installing Drupal in this stack, and getting things up and running. We have submitted the training to DrupalCon. If it gets accepted and you get out there, I'd love to see you all come in if you're interested. And I'll probably be doing this session at a couple of the other camps, and if you're interested in getting started and want more technical information, please feel free to reach out. Got my contact information up there, so happy to answer any questions you might have. Enjoy the rest of the camp.